Imagine a world where two nations are locked in a silent war, not with bullets or bombs, but with rockets, satellites, and the ultimate goal of conquering the stars. What really sparked this race to space, and why did it become a battle for global dominance? The space race wasn't just about science or exploration. It was a high-stakes competition fueled by fear, ambition, and the desire to prove who truly ruled the 20th century. And it changed our world forever. The history of the space race began in the aftermath of World War II, when the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's two dominant superpowers. This wasn't just a war of words or political policies. It was a battle for global influence, one that would soon expand beyond Earth and into the stars, and space, an almost untouchable realm for humankind, would become the ultimate stage for this contest. The roots of the space race were planted deep within the ruins of Nazi Germany. During the war, the Germans developed the world's first long-range guided missile, the V-2 rocket. While the rocket's purpose was military, its potential for exploration was undeniable. After the war, the US and the Soviet Union both sought to harness this technology. The US brought over many of Germany's top scientists, most notably Wernher von Braun, to work on their own missile and rocket programs. Meanwhile, the Soviets did the same, creating their own rocket development teams, and both nations set their sights on something far greater than military dominance: space. In the early days, the rivalry was almost invisible to the general public. The focus was still largely on military applications, but that quickly changed as both nations realized the strategic value of space exploration. Whoever controlled space could control communications, weather satellites, and possibly even missile defense systems. But, even more than that, space was a blank canvas where technological breakthroughs could reshape society itself. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union made its first major move in this new space war. They launched Sputnik 1, a simple satellite no larger than a beach ball, into Earth's orbit. It weighed just 184 pounds, but was capable of sending out a steady beeping signal that could be picked up by radio receivers across the globe. The significance of this achievement wasn't just in the technology, it was in the message it sent. The Soviet Union had not only developed a functional satellite, but demonstrated their capacity to send rockets beyond Earth's atmosphere, and the implications were terrifying to the US leadership. In America, the Sputnik launch caused widespread panic. The nation had been caught off guard, and it seemed like the Soviet Union had pulled ahead in the technological arms race. The US government scrambled to respond. In 1958, President Dwight D. Eisenhower created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, an independent agency tasked with coordinating America's space efforts. The formation of NASA was the US's formal recognition that space was no longer a science fiction dream. It was a real and dangerous arena for global power. But even with NASA's creation, the early days of American space exploration were shaky. The US attempted to launch a satellite, Vanguard TV-3, but it exploded just seconds after liftoff in 1957, leading the media to mockingly nickname it Flopnik. By contrast, the Soviet Union wasn't just successful, they were relentless. In November of 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, carrying the first living creature into space, a dog named Laika. Though Laika didn't survive the flight, she died a few hours after reaching orbit. The mission signaled that the Soviets were ahead in the race to conquer the cosmos, and they had the audacity to send living beings into space. By 1961, the Soviet Union shocked the world once again by sending Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet cosmonaut, into orbit. Gagarin's spacecraft, Vostok 1, made a single orbit around the Earth in 108 minutes. His flight was the first time a human had traveled beyond the confines of Earth, and it cemented his place in history as a global hero. The news reverberated around the world. Gagarin's grin, beaming from Soviet propaganda posters, became a symbol of Soviet scientific achievement. And for many in the US, it was a humiliating defeat. The United States, despite their efforts, had been bested again. The embarrassment of being second in the space race spurred President John F. Kennedy into action. On May 25, 1961, Kennedy stood before Congress and boldly declared that the United States would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. This statement came at a time when the U.S. space program was nowhere near prepared to achieve such an ambitious feat. The space race had suddenly become much more than a contest between two nations. It had become a defining moment in the Cold War. For the U.S., reaching the moon was a matter of national pride, a way to demonstrate to the world that democracy and capitalism were superior to Soviet communism. NASA's Apollo program became the cornerstone of America's efforts. To make the moon landing a reality, the U.S. would need to develop a massive and highly sophisticated space program. Projects like Mercury and Gemini laid the groundwork, focusing on perfecting spaceflight, training astronauts, and solving complex technical challenges. The Mercury program, which successfully put Alan Shepard into space in 1961, proved that humans could survive in space, albeit briefly. The Gemini program, which ran from 1965 to 1966, tested longer missions, spacewalks, and spacecraft rendezvous techniques, critical elements for the future of the Apollo missions. But the path was never smooth. In 1967, the Apollo 1 tragedy struck, killing astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee during a routine test of the spacecraft. The fire, which broke out in the pure oxygen environment of the cabin, was a devastating blow to the Apollo program. The accident led to a major overhaul of Apollo's design and safety protocols, and it delayed the program for over a year. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's space program faced its own challenges. The Soviets had a bold ambition to land their own cosmonauts on the moon, but their N-1 rocket, designed to carry their lunar lander, was plagued with failures. The rocket exploded on several test flights, preventing the Soviet Union from mounting a serious challenge to the Apollo missions. At the same time, Soviet leadership was also shaken by the death of Sergei Korolev, the genius engineer behind their space program, in 1966. Korolev's death marked the end of an era for Soviet space exploration and left a void that the program struggled to fill. But while the Soviets were faltering, the U.S. was pushing forward. On December 24, 1968, Apollo 8 became the first mission to orbit the moon. The three astronauts aboard, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders, did not land on the moon, but their achievement was nonetheless historic. They took the iconic Earthrise photo, one of the most recognized images in human history, showing Earth rising above the barren, lifeless surface of the moon. This image captured the imagination of millions and solidified the sense that humanity was on the brink of a new era. And then, in 1969, it happened. Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969, with astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins aboard. Armstrong and Aldrin's successful landing on the moon on July 20, 1969, and Armstrong's famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," marked the end of the space race. The United States had won. It wasn't just a victory for NASA, or even for the U.S., it was a victory for all of humanity. For the first time in history, human beings stood on the surface of another celestial body. The race was over, but the legacy of space exploration had only just begun. The Soviet Union never managed to match the moon landing. Their N-1 rocket, designed for lunar missions, failed repeatedly. The U.S. had won the race to the moon, but the space race wasn't over. Both nations continued to push boundaries, creating space stations, advancing satellite technology, and eventually collaborating on projects like the Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975. Want to dive deeper into humanity's greatest milestones? Watch the next video to uncover more stories that shaped our world.